Welcome to the Small Town Pastor Podcast. This podcast is a ministry of Small Town Network. We exist to make disciples, train pastors, and plant churches in smaller communities. My name is Erik Neilson, and I'm joined by my co-host, Tony Coulombe. Say hello, Tony.
Hello.
I noticed that both of us, for our first episode, shaved our shiny heads, and I think maybe you like buffed and waxed yours too.
It does seem like it. I must be
Looking
sitting
good.
right under one of my office lights. Yes.
When we made the decision to do the podcast in video and audio format, it kind of upped the stakes a little bit. I even put on a collared shirt today. So,
Oh, I've got a clean hoodie on, so we're good.
right. Well, we are starting this podcast. Tony and I knew each other. Man, when did we first meet? Was that back when you're in college?
Yeah, I think that was probably a spring break trip some of us from Ozark took in like 2003.
Back in 2003. Okay.
Yeah.
We were planting our first church and brought out a group of students from Ozark Christian College. Tony was part of that group, and so he helped us knock on doors and do some kind of street evangelism type things, prayer things, to get
hmm
our first church planted. And then since then, we've kind of reconnected. And I said, "Hey, Tony, you want to start a podcast?" And he's like, "Yeah, of course."
Why
So
not?
yeah, so we want to talk a little bit about episode 1 and 2. We're actually just going to kind of introduce ourselves and tell our stories. And so Tony's actually going to go first. And so, Tony, why don't you start by just telling us like where you live, kind of your, growing up story and how you ended up where you are.
Sure. Yeah, so Tony Coulombe and I live in a little community called Warrenton, Oregon, Gearhart, north coast of Oregon, Clatsop County. We are really famous for being the location where Goonies and Kindergarten Cop was filmed. So that's typically what I tell people is where I'm from, and it usually connects the dots. But Clatsop County is about 41,000 people altogether. Not very churched here, but I grew up in the church, a church called the Warrenton Christian Church. And I started coming to the church when we moved into a neighborhood next door to the lead pastor of the church at the time, who had kids my age. And so it was a natural fit. Just started coming here probably in first grade. Grew up in the church, very involved in youth group. My youth minister was an Ozark Christian College alumni. And so that was the
Was that
connection. Larry
Larry?
Osborne.
We
Yeah.
got to give a shout out to Larry Osborne.
Good old Larry Osborne. Yes.
Since we're like social media wizards, we'll do like a hashtag Larry
Right.
Osborne.
Yeah. Yeah. The infamous Larry
I mean,
Osborne.
in youth ministry circles, Larry Osborne is
Right.
literally a legend. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Not to be confused with the Larry Osborne that wrote Sticky Teams.
no, that guy's rich. Our Larry
Yeah.
is not rich. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. This is the small town pastor.
Right.
But Larry was my connection to Ozark. And so I ended up going out to Missouri to college, got a degree there. Um, Went and did an internship in New Orleans, moved there 3 months before Katrina hit, went through all of that, spent a year with the church down there altogether, Journey Christian Church. After that, just felt like it was time to try something different. Ended up back in Missouri, connected with some guys, ended up in Japan for a little while with an organization that is now called Mustard Seed Network, and
Oh,
they're
yeah.
working on getting their 12th church by this year in Japan, which is really amazing.
That is amazing. So are you
Um,
fluent? Are you fluent in Japanese?
no, no, I was getting pretty decent at Japanese, but I wasn't there very long. I came back to the States because I was struggling with some sin. And so
Okay.
needed to come back, get out of that environment, spend some time actually at a little bit of a live-in program ministry thing
Okay.
and went through that. And that was out in like the middle of Kentucky. When that was done, I moved back home and I was basically 27, single, and living with my parents in Clatsop County. I wasn't going back to Japan. I didn't know what was next. I thought I was done with ministry, and I
Hmm.
had put all my education and work experience in that basket. So I was pretty low, to be quite honest. But being back home, there was a guy who was a pastor here at this church, at the same church, Warrenton Christian Church, by the name of Mike Packer, who
Mike, I love
would
that.
He's a great guy. Yeah. Grew up in Salt Lake. He also went to Ozark as an older student after me. And through a mutual friend, he got the connection to me and to getting the job here as the lead pastor. So when I moved back here in 2009, he was the lead pastor here at the church. And we started to get to know each other. And he basically, with some of our elders, came to me and said, "We don't think that God's done with you yet, and we want to bring you on staff very part-time as an associate." So started out late 2009 as an associate at my home church.
At your home church, man.
At
I
my
just want to pause real quick and say, what a fantastic word to like say to a young guy that's uncertain about his future. Like, God's
yeah,
not done with you yet, and we
yeah,
believe in you. And even to like invest in you, even though if it, it's part-time, it's a little bit of money, a little bit of
yeah,
responsibility, but to take a, I don't know if I want to say take a chance, but like
right.
to invest in someone,
Yep.
believe in someone. And what did that mean for you at the time when they kind of invited you back into your home church
Oh,
like that?
it was a rescue line. I mean, I was really depressed. I don't know if I'd ever been to that kind of a low in my life at that point in my young life.
Hmm.
Um, because I'd gone through moral failure, and with that there was a lot of shame, and I believed, and this is what the devil will do to you, right? I believed more people knew about my junk than actually knew about my junk,
Interesting.
so there was kind of some embarrassment and some shame involved there, and I just didn't think that I was going to go back into ministry. And so getting that opportunity once again really felt like a John chapter 21 moment where Jesus pulls Peter aside and like asks him multiple times, right? "Do you love me?"
Yeah.
And like, "Yes, I love you." And to think, and then that chapter really started to become almost like my life chapter. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Um, where I thought I had failed in such a miserable way, but yet there was still redemption. And so that has radically changed the way I've approached everything, in ministry sense. And it just kind of took off from there. We started growing as a church, and I started getting more hours and more responsibility in an associate role.
Mhm.
And eventually we got to the point where God was doing some really great things. Mike was a good leader, a really great pastor, and had a good system and structure in place for us. And I was just kind of the yes man, do whatever was asked of me type of person. Um,
I
but
need a couple of yes men. Where can I find
I
find
know
those
that's a
guys
great associate
who
role
just
to
do what I
have.
say? That'd be
you
amazing.
know,
Wow.
just that humble servant role, of like, yep, sure, I'll do that. I had I had that excitement to do a variety of things, not just one specific role. So it worked out perfect.
Now,
Especially
were
in
you, I'm sorry,
okay,
it's somewhere in this timeline. Is that where you met your wife?
yeah, yeah. So even as I was coming back on, it was probably about a year into being on staff that I'd filled in for Mike a couple times. And my wife's dad and stepmom were attending the church at the time, and they
Okay.
heard me fill in for Mike. And they were planning a wedding for one of their other daughters here at our church. And they were conspiring behind the scenes to introduce me to Christy, my wife, their oldest daughter.
Oh, okay. Just kind of
So
a
so the
setup.
stepmom shows up to the office with a big plate of chocolate chip cookies specifically to invite me to the
Would you
wedding.
like a cookie? Here's my daughter. Like,
"Here's a plate of cookies. Would you please come to the wedding?" I'm like, "Well, absolutely. I'll come to the wedding. Cookies are the key to my heart." So I got invited, and I had no idea what they were plotting until like a couple days before the wedding happened. And it was like, "Oh, crud, not another one of these, young single guy in ministry." There's all kinds of women, older ladies in the church that have a daughter, a niece, a granddaughter that they want to introduce you to. And it's never great.
yeah.
Uh, but when we actually met, it felt like one of those scenes from Wayne's World, with the Dream Weaver, like
Dreamweaver
that whole
moment.
stuff. Yeah. So it felt like that, and it just took off. And so we ended up getting married in May of 2011. So we've been
Okay.
married for coming up on 14 years now, I guess.
Yeah, and you've got one child, right?
Yep, one kid, Rosie, who's 11. And so, yeah, it just once I really settled into the idea that I think God has allowed me to go through the things that I've gone through and to bring me back home to Clatsop County,
Yeah.
that this was his plan for me. Once I
Yeah.
settled into that mentality, then things just kind of started like coming. And
Start
that's
clicking.
about the time I met Christy. I got hired on more, even more of a part-time role with more responsibility, got offered a full-time position at the church.
Okay.
And which was great because then I could quit my other part-time job in town and focus. We had a lot of other things going on. It wasn't shortly after that we were getting ready to start another location here in Clatsop County.
Oh, and
And
that's that. Okay. So that started with Mike. I forgot that.
yes,
Okay.
yes,
Go
I
ahead.
was an associate with Mike, and we had a gentleman here that had a pretty incredible testimony. Spent some time in prison, was older, was involved in another Christian ministry, Christian Crusaders motorcycle ministry. Um, and so he had some preaching experience, was pretty green, but just had this passion to get out and preach. And so Mike was trying to use that passion with him to start another location in Seaside. And we found a space and we were ramping up to get that going. We were promoting it to the church. And then so my role as an associate was going to be to split my time between the two Warrenton services and the Seaside service every other week and just coordinate those things and make sure everything's going well, support how best I could. Along that while we were casting the vision for the church for this other location and ramping up and getting prepared, there was another couple that were driving from a community east of Astoria called Napa Swenson. It's about 30
Okay.
minutes east of here.
Is it
30 to 40
unincorporated?
minutes.
It's just an area.
They have their own school district out there. They do not have their own post office, so they're technically Astoria. But
Okay.
it's a community out there between Brownsmead, Napa, and Swenson of maybe 4,000 people altogether out there in
Okay.
the rural area. And there's a couple churches out there, but there's a lot of people that would drive 30 to 45 minutes into town to go to other churches, including this couple that were coming into our church every week. And when they heard us talking about our heart to do these types of things and to start other locations,
Mhm.
they approached us and said, "Hey, we've got a number of people out here that meet for weekly Bible studies and would love to see something like what you guys are doing in our community." And so we met with them and a variety of other couples. I mean, it was a full house. And Mike and I sat down and heard from them, kind of shared what our vision was. We were a small church, we were 200 people, which is a pretty good size for our area, but certainly didn't have the resources to like launch off a brand new church or find a
Right.
pastor. And so we basically told them like, look, here's what we can provide for you. Preaching. That's it.
I was
So,
like, I thought there was like a comma and there was like a couple other things. It was just like,
nope, preaching, period. And so and we told them like, you have to be involved in this if it's going to work. And this is what we're about. We'd love to see this. And they were all like, yeah, we're gung ho, let's do this. And as Mike and I were driving back to town, it was like, okay, how are we going to do this? Like, what time are we going to do the service? Who's going to preach out there? Are we going to arrange for Mike to do 2 services in Warrenton and then a service in Napa? Bob's doing Seaside. So we were just trying to brainstorm. And all the while, because I had filled in enough for Mike preaching and I was getting some encouragement in that role, that I just had this tugging on my heart. And I said, what if I preached? And he was like, wait a minute, are you serious? I thought you didn't want to be a preacher. Well, I didn't want the responsibility of being the preacher, is what I didn't want.
right. Yeah.
So I was like, you can be the guy where the responsibility falls upon. But so, anyways, I was like, let me go home and talk to Christy about that and let's pray about it. And came back to him. I said, yeah, I think that's something I want to do. So that's what happened. And in January of 2013, we started meeting weekly out in Napa. And there was a small group that came, maybe 20, 25 people. And how it worked, there's a building out there where a Lutheran church in Astoria owned the building. It used to be an old Lutheran church. It was called Emmanuel Community Church or something like that.
during church or
There
yeah.
was a preschool meeting out of that building on a weekly for 10 years prior to us starting there, I believe. And they were kind of under the oversight of First Lutheran in Astoria. And
Okay.
so I talked with First Lutheran, and they decided they would rent the building out to us for $300 a month. So it was like, we
Praise
can
God.
afford that. You know, we can afford that. I'm on staff. We got 25 people. And so service sound, it was like 10:30 or something is when we did service. And I'd walk in, I'd plug, I had like a wireless microphone and a little, a traveling sound system there. And I'd plug
Portable,
my
yeah.
iPad into it, and I would play some pre-service music on my iPad. And oh, it's time for church to start. And I'd walk up there, stop the music, just preach. And then
Hmm.
I would go straight from the sermon into like a communion meditation. And then we would have communion together, and I would push play on the exit music. And thanks for being here today. I mean, that was it. There was no worship set. There was no children's ministry, none of that business. And
It's amazing.
it went all right for a while.
Wait, now
People,
hold on a sec before you go on, because I think
yeah.
there's something that's really important here, especially for like what small town network is about, is that a lot of
Mhm.
churches in smaller communities that are smaller churches themselves, they've kind of bought into this idea that we could never, right, plant a
Right,
church. We could never
right,
start something in the town next door.
right.
Um, and they've got reasons, and I think some of it is like perceptions, right?
Yeah,
It's like it has to be like it would have to be exactly like what we have, and we don't have a full-time pastor for them, and we don't have a
right,
building, and we don't have kids ministry and worship,
right.
and so you guys somehow didn't believe that stuff. You guys basically had a vision of like, hey, here's an opportunity,
Yeah,
and we can't do the 10 things that everybody thinks you need to have for a
yep,
successful church. We can do one thing.
yep,
And then you said, instead of like, and so we can't do it, you're like,
right.
we've got this one thing we can do, and we'll do that. We're willing to
Yeah,
do that.
yeah.
So what allowed you guys to have that kind of like what I would call like kingdom vision, where you
Hmm.
go, you know what, there's some people that need someone to give them the word. We've
Hmm.
got some people, let's do it. What caused you to say yes to that instead of like the
Hmm.
normal response, which my perception is most people would say, no, we can't do that.
Right,
Why'd you
right.
guys say yes?
You know, um, so a couple things, just a little bit of a story. I mean, my education was church planting stuff. I when I was a student at Ozark, the very first church planting class for that was in development for a church planting degree, I was in that class. Like we helped name a church planting book written by Tom Jones for Stadia. It's like,
Well, I
and
read
then
that book. Yeah.
yeah, church planting from the ground up. You're
Yep.
welcome. Our class named it.
Thank you.
So like I went through all that stuff. I mean, I lived in New Orleans, and that was at a church plant. I went to Japan to plant churches. So it's like I was passionate about that stuff. There's no doubt about it. And you're right. There's always like this. These are the things you got to have in place in order to plant a church. But we had an elder here that was a missionary for years in places like Papua New Guinea and India. And he was a spiritual giant. He would stop by the offices, grab Mike and I and say, "Boys, we're going on a flyover." And so when he was
Boys,
in
get in the car.
get in the car, we're going on a flyover, quote unquote, for the people that can't aren't watching the video. Um, and he'd throw us in the car, we'd grab some coffee, and we'd drive out to like Napa, Swenson. And so when he was a missionary in New Guinea, he would fly over the jungles until he would find a pocket of people, like a little tribe, and they would find a place to land. They'd march in and they'd preach the gospel. And so that was his mentality with going out to that part of the county. It was like,
That is amazing.
he's like, boys, there are people out here. This place needs a church. So this was like a couple of years before this one couple even approached us about starting the church out there. So we were already kind of in a mentality of prayer about what God might open up the doors for in a
Right.
community like that.
Right.
And so for us, the mentality was when that was starting to kind of get some momentum and we could see the doors opening, it was just really a heart of flexibility of like, we'll do whatever we can do. You know what I mean?
Right.
I think sometimes we get so caught up in like a comparison game, or we feel like we've been taught from people who've done it so long, or they've done it this way and they've been successful, and
Right.
so rightly so they have written books and they're teaching at seminars. But it's like, man, how many churches around the world over church history have been started in similar ways? It's just like, here's a group of people and we're going to teach the word, and we're just starting to have a fellowship and see what it develops into.
Yeah, like
You
what instead of like, you know, like thinking like what you can lose,
Uh-huh.
what the cost might be, or
Right.
the perception of failure if it doesn't work, or whatever
Yeah.
the things are that are holding us back. There's kind of like, what have we got to lose? Like, why
Yeah.
not try it and,
Yeah.
see what happens? So you
Yeah.
guys did that. I kind of interrupted you. So you did this, you said yes to this thing,
Uh-huh.
heart for like the gospel and for the kingdom of God. And then you started this thing in that building, and
Yeah.
about 20 people is kind of where we left off.
Yeah, about 20 to 30 people or so maybe, and it was consistent for a while, and eventually, you know how this is with launching a church. The people that were at that initial meeting that said they were all gung ho and would help out with this, that, and the other thing, they
Hmm.
ended up leaving. They didn't stick around. They didn't realize it was going to require as much from them as we told them it would. You
Right.
know, as far as getting involved in doing stuff for children's, or like music, if we wanted to bring on worship stuff during the service. Um, but at the same time, other people were starting to come. And so we eventually got to where it felt like your stereotypical church service, like we had a band playing and those things. And
Not,
over
not
time,
the iPad. Yeah.
well, yeah, not just the iPad with cheesy walk-in music, jars of clay or something like that. You
I
know,
remember Jars of Clay. I was there.
right. So, yeah, eventually it came to the point though where Mike Packer took a call to go back to his home church in Salt Lake City.
I was
And
thinking that earlier that both of you guys ended up
Mhm.
basically leading your home churches. Okay, that's
Yeah,
all.
yeah, it's pretty bizarre. It's awesome though. It really is. So through that process though, he was like, "Look, I'm going to tell the elders that you should be the next lead pastor." And I'm like, "Don't do that. I don't want to be the lead pastor. I'm fine preaching out here. I don't want to be the lead guy." And he was arguing with me about it. I said, "Listen, okay, if the elders are unanimous, I'll just take that as a sign from the Lord that that's what I should probably do. Like my name's Gideon and here's my fleece, sort of a thing." And um, but they met and they were all unanimous, and I was like, "Okay, crud." And that didn't work out like I thought it would.
Here
And
we
so I
go.
took I
Yeah.
took the role as lead, and started doing that in June of 2014. So coming up on 11 years in the lead role.
Good for you, man. That's great. 11 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, after
And so
that,
wait, so how long altogether though? From the time
I've
you
been
started?
here since November of 2009. Well, on staff since November of 2009. So getting close to 16 years
That's crazy.
here in
My friend and I have this joke about the 17-year itch. We like know a lot of people that like at year 17
yeah.
like went on to something different, like moved locations, and so just be forewarned.
I'm pretty locked in with some other things at the moment. I mean, I'll never say never to, whatever might come about, but just our family dynamic and everything right now, I'm pretty settled in for a while, but
Yeah,
uh
so you're just watching our time and stuff. So
yeah.
with your you've got that going. I, I
Uh-huh.
I remember I think it was Mike telling me when you guys started this, he said we've got this idea that like and you said it about your current associate Corey too to me that like we instead of having like a staff guy by himself over there and a staff guy by himself over here
Yeah.
and two buildings and two copy machines and two, right?
Yeah.
Like you guys pool resources
Hmm.
and you work together during the week and everything's kind of centered at your church.
Yeah.
And then you
Yeah.
simply just travel to the location.
Yeah.
And so in a way, it's almost like a small town version of, campus ministry, a campus type concept where
Right.
you're taking what you're already doing and
Yeah.
just taking it to another location on,
Yeah.
the street, right? Am I describing that accurately?
Yeah, it really is like a smaller version of a multi-site strategy. I mean, it really is what we do here. It's just funny because it seems like a church our size shouldn't be able to do this. And since COVID, we're smaller than we were before we started these other locations. I mean, out here in Oregon, we really got hammered by that stuff.
Yeah, sure.
But to cut out a lot of time in between when we started that church and where we're at now, we had another associate come out for a while, and he was out there at that location for a number of years before he took a job at another place. And through that, we were wrestling with, is this going to be an independent church someday or not? We had that maybe in our mind that maybe they'd launch off to themselves. And as we were just kind of struggling with the attendance and the strategy and the resources to pour into it, it was just like, that's not going to work. So let's just adopt this full on, wholehearted, unapologetically. It is our church. We're one church. We have two locations. We had to close down the Seaside one. It didn't work out.
Okay.
But we got to the point where the Napa one was just continuing to be consistent. People were coming. It's never been to the point where financially it could sustain itself, but between the two places, we can support that. And so when our associate out there, Corey, left to go take another position, I started preaching all three services. And, we had the timing set up such that it worked out for that. And so it's a lot of driving, it's a lot of preaching on a Sunday, but it's really cemented that one church philosophy. And so now we just talk about, we're not multiple locations, we're one church with three services, and one of our services is in Napa.
That's
And
super interesting to me because I know it's maybe like a word game, right? But
mhm,
there's something I think really important about that to say, what if we see like our services in different locations as like a one church versus a
yep,
probably a larger church multi-site model, which is like, one church, many locations, and each
right,
location has a lead pastor and staff
right,
that work. So kind of micro version, and
right,
just saying like we have multiple services, they just happen to be in different locations. I
yep,
think that's language, Tony, and like vision that a lot of small town churches and small town pastors like need to grab hold of because
yeah,
we always think we're so preconditioned to think, how do I get this one bigger?
right,
That most people would be trying to figure out how to get those people to drive from that
right,
location to come to your place
right,
so that it can be bigger. Because that's how we've
right,
all been trained in the books we
yeah,
read. How do I get this bigger? But when you take that kingdom mentality of like, how do I get the kingdom to be bigger?
right,
Then like you can start drawing it up in ways that people don't normally draw it up. And you
yeah,
come up with creative solutions.
yep.
And I think what you're doing is pretty rare. I don't know. Do you run into many people that like relate to that or are doing what you're doing?
Not in a community our size or a church our size. I mean, right now, our weekly attendance is probably around 175. So to think we're doing three services just doesn't, like, you would not talk about that
Three
as a
services, 175, right?
smart strategy. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
that's
Like,
great.
one of our services has the lion's share of that attendance.
Right.
Um, but at the same time, it's like, being where we're at in our context, where there's a lot of tourism, there's a lot of coming and going, how things are in a lot of communities now with sports and kids. If everybody shows up on the same Sunday, we've got a lot of people here.
Don't
But
forget hunting.
yeah, hunting, of course,
We're
of
gonna have to
course.
do like a special episode about like pastors who hunt or something because we
Yeah,
need to
there
talk.
are people that come to our church because I hunt.
Absolutely.
So
For real, man. It's real. The thing is
it's
real.
a part of our culture here. But
So one more thing I wanted to ask you about, and
mhm,
I'm not trying to put you on the spot or get you to commit to anything, but you and I, when we had lunch a couple months ago, or last month, you said there's this like little town across the river
mhm,
for people that aren't familiar with Oregon,
yeah,
the North Coast and stuff. You're very close to the state of Washington,
yeah,
separated by the Columbia River. So
yep,
as you like are thinking these kingdom kind of thoughts,
yep,
you don't have to name the town or anything, but just the fact that you're thinking that, like, tell
yep.
tell them like what the brief thought on that, like it's like a someday if the Lord provides kind of a
Yeah,
thought.
absolutely. So, yeah, across the river from Astoria, there's a community over there on the Long Beach Peninsula, and people live over there and they drive into town all the time. And so we've had people for years now, for years, even since I was a kid, coming from little communities over there, Ilwaco, Long Beach, Nacelle, driving into Warrenton. And it's a similar type thing to the Napa. I mean, they're driving 40, 45 minutes, some of them, to come into town, and they'll make a whole thing of it. They'll come into town for church, they'll do the Costco shopping, and then they'll go back. Um, and so it's just been something that we've thought about as a church for decades now. What if an opportunity ever comes along to start something over there? And there have been some other churches that have tried, and it hasn't been super successful. I don't know if we would have any necessarily secret sauce versus them,
Right.
what they did wrong versus what we would do. But in that situation, because it would just add more logistics, that would probably be a scenario where we would need to look at hiring even more staff and probably another preacher, and start developing our preacher corps and our stable
Right.
of people to share that burden, versus me preaching 4 services,
Yeah, that
and
at
that,
some point that breaks down, man.
yeah, it's not going to work at that point. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of things to think through, but I mean, we're even having conversations in our leadership and staff and with our key people of changing the name of our church. So right now, our church is called Christian Church Warrenton Napa. So you've got the 2 locations in our church name. We were at one point Christian Church of Warrenton and Christian Church of Napa. And so there was a separation even in the naming. But since we're trying to have this one church philosophy, we just sandwiched it all together. Well, that's a mouthful. It's too much. And then it limits you. What if you add another location?
Right. Because right.
you
Yeah. Yeah.
know so we've got some ideas. We're going through. We're going to maintain Christian Church in the name. We find that to be very valuable. I think people get way too creative and clever when it comes to some church naming. You don't know what you're getting.
Yeah.
Also, Google, man, people come into town and they're looking for a Christian church in
Yeah.
Astoria, and boom, it pops up because
There it is.
nobody else is named Christian Church around here.
Yeah.
So it works out really good that way. But so we're thinking in those terms, like we want a more generic name for not only to cement our philosophy of what we're currently doing, but also to keep the doors open to, if something across the river happens, if something
Absolutely.
down the coast happens, if something
Yeah.
up Highway 30 ever happens. There are, in this corner of our state, littler communities that would be overlooked by church planning organizations because
Right.
we're not in a suburban area. We're not in a
Right.
metro area. Like that's
Yeah.
where
The
the
model, that
strategy
model, that
earns the
model.
money to
Yeah.
pay back to the organization, right?
Doesn't work. It's a funding
So,
model. It's hard to get people to move to those towns,
right.
and all that. So,
Yeah.
let me wrap up with this. Well, what do you love about your small town? Like, tell people in a couple of sentences, what do you love about Warrenton, Oregon?
Well, for me, it's my hometown too. So I love knowing people and being known by people, and that might sound a little narcissistic, but that's a
No,
part
it's
of
not.
being in a community though, right? And why I think people love church so much is being connected really well, knowing stories,
Yeah.
knowing backgrounds, having some of that social credibility with people. It makes a difference. Seeing people I grew up with raising their kids and getting to minister to them at this new season of life, those things are a blessing. But
Right.
also, that specific area we live in is just ridiculously beautiful. It's hard to
It
beat
is.
this place on a sunny day.
For
So,
people on a sunny day, I was just gonna
on a
say,
sunny
man,
day.
for people that don't know, like the north coast of Oregon,
Yeah.
when it's nice there, there's like
No,
nowhere nicer.
no, it's hard to
And
beat.
if you like to hunt elk, I mean,
Absolutely.
that's prime time, man.
Yeah.
Well, that's great, man. And we're gonna wrap for today. I'm sure both of us will have a chance to tell our stories as we go on. For the people watching or listening, if they're assuming, it's not just me and you watching and listening. If you like what we're doing, please hit like or subscribe. If you're interested in Small Town Network, you can find us online at smalltownnetwork.com. And if you believe in the importance of planting disciple-making churches in smaller communities, we'd love you to prayerfully consider partnering with us in prayer and financial support. You have been listening to the Small Town Pastor Podcast. See you next time.